nice. You know, we had this new faculty member come in. And then he tells me he's going to talk on regulatory issues, and I'm thinking, we'll get 6 people in the audience. So it was very, very kind of you to all come out. You can barely hear me. Hear me a little bit? No. Okay, I'll yell pretty loud. So, Dr. Califf began his medical school career here at Duke. He went off to UCSF for his residency. He came back to Duke for fellowship and then couldn't get out of here for a lot of years. He rose to be the Donald Fortin Professor of Medicine, the Vice Chancellor of the institution, ran a lot of stuff. Then went off to the FDA where he ran some more stuff. And he'll tell you about those experiences and lessons learned over the course of the next hour. We've been lucky enough to have Rob join us back here in a capacity to be still defined, but he doesn't need many roles or titles to do what Rob does, and only Rob can do. So not to take too much of his time away, but just to say that we are honored and privileged to have him back here and speaking at the DCRI, the home that he built. This is a little bit like Saturday Night Live. I don't know how many times Rob has hosted. But I'm sure it'll be just as entertaining as it ever was. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric, and it's great to see a little bit of a turnout here. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah, and it has been kind of amazing to come back, especially, as many of you know, for the last 2 years, due to what used to be federal conflict of interest rules. I was not allowed to even talk to people at Duke without going through an ethics consultation. That appears to have changed a little bit in the current administration, but it did, I think, create a fascinating situation for me of coming back after 2 years and now spending my time working for my new bosses, Mary Klotman, Eric Peterson, and Manesh Patel. I've been going around talking with people and sending them observations about what I'm hearing. So be careful if you run into me in the elevator. You may get reported to various bosses about what you think and have to say. So, all right, let's see here. Well, let's try this one. Uh-oh.
Some things don't change.
Yeah, some things don't change, that's right. I'm trying all the different, just use the clicker.
This could be enough.
Okay, all right, we're in business, great. So, just first of all, just thank you to the many people I've run into since I've been back now for about a month. And Eric went through the history, but I spent really the majority of my life here. And after 2 years away, it is a bit like cleaning out your parents' attic, except in this case, it's my attic that I'm cleaning out as I go through things. But, you know, I had a tremendous experience at FDA. It was really fun every single day. But on coming back, the warmth and the positive reception has really meant a lot. I can't tell you how many people I've just run into in the hallway who have had nice things to say. And I think despite all the frustrations you may have in your job, there's no question that the underlying ethos at Duke is one of support and friendship, and I hope that's something that people keep in mind and try to perpetuate as much as they possibly can. And of course, for me, it all sort of began when, as a medical student, I got exposed to the use of computers in medicine. It was happening here before most other places, and much of what I'm going to talk about today is trying to integrate the things that I learned along the way with the things that I saw at FDA to give you a glimpse of at least where I think things are headed. Now, this is the first article that I published in the Western Journal of Medicine, of all places. But it seemed entirely possible then that we could live in a world where doctors and patients spent their time talking about the choices that needed to be made, fully informed by information that had been collected using computers. And I think in the article I said this should be happening within 5 years, and that was in 1978 or something like that. So here we are, almost 40 years later. And those of you who have been to the clinic lately, I'm sure would agree with me that this is still not happening today. But as we think about the work of the DCRI, I do think we're now in an era where the technology is absolutely not an impediment. The whole issue is humans adapting to technology. And I believe that you all have the chance to be at the forefront of making this happen. I was also taken when I went to the latest version of the website, and there's the old mission statement still there. And I still vividly remember when we were coming up with this mission statement, and I think it's every bit as true now. In fact, having spent a lot of time with patient advocacy groups over the last several years who have a lot of concerns and interest, I think there's tremendous need for people to keep this kind of a mission in mind, that the purpose of what we do is to improve how our fellow human beings do, not to write the next paper or get credit for the next breakthrough or just to get a paycheck. And it's something that's very much alive, I can tell you, deeply within the FDA. And the dedication of people at the DCRI to this mission is something that makes it a place that's very positively viewed in a place like the FDA. Now, the bottom line on what I've learned about the regulatory system, I really do believe it basically works, despite what you may read from some politicians over the last month. If we look at the development of products that are related to health, basically the system works. But it's also true that it's far from perfect, and the world is changing pretty rapidly right now, and the system needs to change with it. I also learned that every element of the regulatory system is deeply supported by laws, regulations, guidances, and precedent. What does that mean? Well, it means for almost every kind of decision that's made, there's a rationale and a logic to it, which starts out with usually a clumsily written law. And as I learned firsthand, particularly with the cures legislation that many of you read about, often the final touches on the law are written by people who know nothing about the topic, who are locked in a room keeping everyone else out. But then the various federal agencies interpret the law and write regulations and guidances that help people understand how to implement the law, usually as it was intended to be written, although often I'll just say that no one seems to understand exactly why the final law was written the way it was. And there are several parts of the cures legislation that are in that category that I will not go over today, but I'll watch with interest to see how it ends up being interpreted. I think the best way to think about the FDA is that it's a referee. And like all referees, it operates by a rule book, but it doesn't write the rule book. The rule book is really written through a complex set of societal interactions that lead to the laws that undergird the efforts of the FDA. And so if you want to fix the FDA, the best thing to do is to fix the rule book and make sure it's operating in a way that reinforces things that are good for the public, which is the intent of the FDA. I'd also say, and this is very well recognized within the FDA, that when it comes to changing things, the people who can do it the best are those who actually have been in the fray, people who have actually tried to develop medical products, have seen the problems, and are trying to make the system better. And there's a tremendous interest in hearing from people about how to make the system better. And important to reinforce here, not in the context of a dispute over an individual product. That is the one thing to always keep in mind. If you want to help the FDA get better and do a better job in the future, don't get into a fight about your individual product and then try to get a law changed because of it. Generalize what you're finding, get other people to agree with you, and then I think there's a very good chance that there'll be a good faith effort to change it. One little technical thing that was fascinating to me is that it's illegal for federal employees to actually be involved in writing a law. But when people write laws, which are generally initially written by lobbyists, I must say what people say about that is true, and then everything gets fixed, but the way it gets fixed is that the law writers ask the federal agencies for what's called technical assistance. And technical assistance is a process by which you are enabled to fix the things that you know are not going to work in a law, or that may be favoring one group over another for a specific reason. So then I'm going to go through 10 general lessons that are very general, and hopefully you'll get something out of this. I'm not sure what, but it sort of reflects a little bit of contemplation on my part of what I've learned, melded with what I thought going into it. First is that the FDA really does affect us all, and you'd be well served as people with expertise to devote a little bit of time of trying to think about how to make the system work better. Regardless of the type of job that you have, it's all important and rolls up into the generation of the evidence that's needed by the FDA to make decisions. So how does it affect us all? It regulates 20 to 25 cents on the dollar in the American economy. Parts of it that I was pretty ignorant about going into the job, cosmetics and food. But as I'll show you in a minute, I think the regulation of the food supply really has a lot in common with medical products, and the concepts turn out to be quite similar. I'm still not sure about cosmetics. It's a, but you know, if you want to realize how serious this can be, remember that right now sunscreen is in almost all cosmetics, particularly that are used by women, on the premise that sunscreen prevents skin cancer, which it probably does. But no one on earth knows what's absorbed when you put sunscreen on your skin and what gets into the circulation or what effects it has. And I can assure you that the industries that make cosmetics have no intention of you ever finding out. So I don't know if Mickey is here. Mickey, yeah, I see you there. You need to work with me to do the study to show what actually gets absorbed, particularly if you put sunscreen on your child every 2 to 3 hours. I suspect there's a reason why the industry is refusing to do the studies that it needs to do, but the FDA doesn't have the authority to force the industry to do it like it does with drugs, because cosmetics are regulated in a different system. Then there's veterinary medicine, which was a lot of fun to learn about, and probably, from my perspective, the least well understood part of the FDA. But we are in this era now where indisputably we're in the One Health environment. That is, we are integrally connected with animals all over the planet because of the revolution in travel that's occurred, so that whatever is in the gut of chickens and cows in Asia is ending up in the human system in the United States fairly quickly. And we can learn that now because we're able to do both genome sequencing and metagenomics of what's inside of animals pretty quickly, and then compare it to what's being seen in the human being. And I'll have a little bit more to say about this in a while, but it's really a fascinating part of the system. The drugs part, all of you know about. We'll talk about that more. Devices is just astounding. The revolution in computation and engineering is leading to a dazzling array of devices that do all kind of weird things that I wouldn't have thought about, and I think offer a lot of opportunity for the future. But how to regulate these kinds of activities to advantage people that are producing devices that are helpful is an enormous challenge. And then biologics are also moving quickly. I'll say more about that. And I'll come back to tobacco also, which is a huge part of what the FDA does now, although the law enabling regulation of tobacco was only passed in 2009. So those are the products regulated by the FDA. What's the mission? The mission of the FDA at its base is protecting the public health by assuring safety. And this is such a core mission, and it's really fascinating how this is taken for granted over periods of time when no disasters occur, and then a disaster occurs and all of a sudden everybody wants to know, where was the FDA? And typically legislation is passed that overcorrects for the disaster and leads to some harmful regulation that then needs to be brought back. But I think the simple way of thinking about this is the fact that you don't have to think about exactly where your food came from every day. It's just an example of something that Americans take for granted because there's a system that's overseen by the FDA that deals with it. Tobacco is now written deeply into the FDA mission. And then the third part, which I used to think and still do to some extent, is in competition with the protection part, is speeding innovation. But I think we're increasingly seeing examples now where the right amount of protection creates a barrier that leads industry to think differently about what it does so that innovation that develops is actually useful instead of, in some cases, being something shiny and new that's either completely useless from the health perspective or may actually do harm. And then this next part is one that I really underestimated. And the real education for me was with something called the nutritional facts label, which is that simple little thing that's on everything you buy in the grocery store. It was a lot of fun participating in the rollout of the new NFL after about 8 years of deep research and with focus groups and cognitive learning. You know, for about 15 items that go on this one thing, what can you put on it that 320 million Americans would find useful that might lead to better health, considering all the differences in education, language, belief structures, and all those kinds of things. One advantage the NFL gave me, by the way, is I got to spend time on stage with Michelle Obama. Everything they say is true. She's smarter than the former president, and she's also taller than I am and stronger than I am, I can assure you. So really quite a remarkable figure who has motivated, I think, a lot of people in a good way to do good things. But just explaining things about products to people is something that we've only scratched the surface on that we've got to do a lot better with. And then this last one, I was completely oblivious to, other than some sort of rudimentary thinking, but an enormous part of the FDA now goes into dealing with the sort of dual emerging threats. One is terrorism, which is extremely concerning right now for a whole variety of reasons. Very sobering when you go to the FDA facility in Massachusetts and see the radiation detector devices that will be used if there's a nuclear attack on the U.S. to do the triaging of who gets medical care and who doesn't, because it's not a situation that can be reversed. And then, of course, the emerging infection problem, which is something that I think we're going to see over and over because of the degree to which we're all interconnected with the animals and plants of the world and all the human beings. But when you think about this part of it, remember that right now there's not an enormous amount of budget that goes to a standing capacity to deal with these emerging threats. And so when something happens, the best people tend to get scarfed up to make some really hard decisions that have to be made. For example, what do you do about developing emergency drugs and vaccines for something like Zika virus? And that, of course, means that your standard applications are going to take a little bit longer to get done because a lot of the people are not going to be there. So there's one piece of advice I have for the new HHS secretary, other than don't mess up insurance for people who previously were uninsured. It's make sure that there's allocation for standing capacity to deal with what's almost certain to happen in the United States over the next period of time. Second lesson is, please don't forget about tobacco and nicotine delivery products. I know it's in the press periodically, but I think there's a bit of complacency, particularly in the medical world, about the concept that we're winning the tobacco battle. And it was a real lesson to be inside the FDA and talk to the people who were there in the Kessler days when the battle went on about getting access to the inside story of what the tobacco companies were doing. And to see the tenacity of these companies in defending their views was really something to see. So in 2009, the legislation was finally passed allowing for regulation of tobacco in the broadest sense, with a focus on children, because there's still a debate about adults and their rights to choose to be addicted if they so choose. My part of it was coming in as we were trying to figure out what to do with not the traditional tobacco products, but all the other stuff that's happened since, including alternative forms of tobacco. There's a real increase right now in throat and mouth cancer because chewable products are particularly being targeted at young white teenagers in rural America. And one advantage I had is because this is all run through user fees to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, is that we were actually able to hire the advertising firms that do the advertising for the tobacco companies. And I just had a sort of a general understanding of it, but I had no idea the degree of targeting that can be done in advertising and the effect it has on particular subsections of the population. So, for example, the cable TV channels that rural teenagers in America watch compared to the average adult in a city are just an entirely different set of media, and the background that sells a concept to them looks entirely different. So I got to see a lot of kids in pickup trucks with shotguns and various things in these ads, but it had an effect. So this is an old slide that I used to use a lot, and my feelings about it are just reinforced after being in the middle of this fray. I think it visually makes the impression that people need to have. So these are the statistics in the U.S., and these are mostly from 2010. And the good news is we're down to about 42 million Americans currently smoking, but the global rate of tobacco use is still going up with very deliberate targeting of developing economies where people may be less educated. This is very much a race and class issue, the way the sales are being targeted. Menthol cigarettes, for example, are very deeply focused on African American communities. And in this slide, you'll see the third one over. E-cigarettes is an epidemic that's almost uniquely American. This is not such a problem in Europe, but teenagers by the boatloads are being addicted to nicotine through e-cigarettes. And there's a really interesting discussion and empirical argument to go on over whether e-cigarettes will be a useful way to get people off of the 42 million people off of the tobacco they're currently using, because there's no question the impact on cancer and heart disease will be less with e-cigarettes, or whether it's simply a way to addict tens of millions of people who, in the words of the tobacco companies in the 70s in their internal documents, termed them customers for life, quote unquote. And it's something that we really need to work through and should be concerned about. Okay, so that's a moralistic lecture. I'll move on to more less sobering topics. It's an amazing time for food, and you know, it's fascinating to look at the food patterns in the United States and globally. We live in a global economy now where there's still hunger, but there's also malnutrition occurring in people who are obese. And in the United States, huge differences according to cultural and social attributes about what people eat and what effect it has on their health. And the main activity of FDA in this regard is with regard to food safety, and with a lot of bipartisan support, including the farming states, we have a whole new food safety system. There's no reason you should have had to think about it, but it was interesting for me to come in and try to help this enormous operation try to change everything it's doing, and see if this doesn't sound familiar to people that have worked on hospital quality improvement. The old system used to be a problem would occur, and then an army of people would be turned loose to try to deal with it and then try to understand what happened and try to prevent it. The new system is totally built on preventive controls and systematic collaboration across the food chain to prevent food outbreaks. These are the basic stats, and this is probably an underestimate. Probably all of us have had a queasy stomach at some point in the last year, and you wonder whether it was a virus or food. There's a good chance it was food, but not enough to really cause a serious illness. But there's still a fair number of Americans who die from foodborne illness. And we're doing such a good job with medicine now that we have a large number of immunocompromised people who are at higher risk from what we would consider routine food. And we're increasingly dependent on a global food supply. 15% of the food supply overall in the U.S. is imported, but seafood, it's over 80%, doesn't come from U.S. territorial waters. And it's getting more complex in high tech. So the new system is built on something that looks a lot like a referral system in medicine, but works better than referral systems in medicine is what I would say, with collaboration required between those on the farm, counties, states, and the federal government, with a lot of documentation of what's being done for quality as part of the requirement of the system. But then I want to tell you about one part of this that I think is a model that I wish in biomedical science that we could emulate, and there are efforts underway to do this. In the good old days, if someone got sick in Kansas City and Chicago 2 days apart, there would be a question, were they getting sick from food that came from the same source or not? And so CDC would send out investigators, things would get swabbed down, you'd grow bacteria on plates, this would take weeks, and then at some point in the future you would come to some determination. What happens now is within 24 to 48 hours we have complete sequencing of the bacteria that was involved. It goes into a publicly available database that's available to academia, industry, state governments, and federal government agencies all together. And if you match up the sequence of that bacteria in those two places, you've got the epidemiology that used to take dozens of people in weeks to take care of. And that piece of information is in the database forever. People can do research on it. It's open source, essentially. Interestingly, the people that put this together were at the NCBI, the National Library of Medicine at the NIH. They're getting nothing from it other than the fact they think this is the coolest public project that they've ever done, because it's having a direct impact on health and creating a model for other people to use. Now, why we don't do this in medicine, for the most part, is beyond me, because the learning that's happening with this system is so much more rapid than anything that I've seen in medicine. Fourth point is that this is not making it up. It's not, I keep asking the question, is the sky really falling this time? But I really do believe that we're at an inflection point in technology where things are ready to take off. And the problem is not going to be the technology development, it's going to be the human adaptation to the technology. Here's one example, and I had the fun of having Dan Mark as an employee for a while. And he's done some fabulous work on trying to understand the laboratory testing system in this country, which is a great story of tremendous brilliance and helping people and greed all at the same time. And over the next few months, I think a lot of this will play out. But if we just look at the laboratory testing system, up until very recently, if you had something you could measure in the blood and you thought it was important, you developed that individual test. You would sort of work it up, raise some venture capital, and then you'd run it through the system, and it might go through the FDA, it might not, but there'd be some mechanism to decide whether the test was worthwhile. We are now within several years at most of having next generation sequencing as an example of many other kinds of tests that will be done, essentially going from one genetic polymorphism at a time to 3.2 billion base pairs, our entire genome, all measured in one test. This, I said good things about Michelle. I'll say some good things about Barack too, because this is a story I do love to tell, so you just have to bear with me for a minute. But when I went up to FDA, I was offered the job overseeing medical products and tobacco. It was said, well, you'll probably become FDA commissioner, but the president has to offer you the job to become FDA commissioner. And so after about 10 months, I'd sort of given up on becoming commissioner. I was having a great time in my job, so I had no regrets. But we were preparing a briefing for the president about next generation sequencing. And about 4 p.m, I got a call saying that briefing you're preparing, you're going to present it to the president tomorrow. You have 5 minutes because he thinks the FDA is a major impediment to this technology being an important part of the American economy. You got 5 minutes to convince him that he's wrong. So with about 12 hours notice, I had my shot at the president, and I was going through the importance of regulation that of the kind that I talked about that stimulates good innovation and doesn't hold it back. And I was making the point about if you have 3.2 billion base pairs and there's a 1% error rate, which is about where we are now, how many false results you have, and it's about 60 to 90,000, it turns out. He had actually done the math while I was talking and beat me to the punchline. I was really thinking about it. So that led to a visit to the Oval Office where we spent 10 minutes talking about basketball because he hates Duke and he loves UNC. I know the workforce here, so. And after we established that neither of us is playing basketball anymore, his knees are as bad as mine, his next question was, what is your golf handicap? Then we got on to the business of FDA commissioner. Well, so the main point here is that what used to be sort of wet lab, work it out one step at a time, the earnest investigator in his or her own lab, trying to amass the resources to get things done, is becoming a heavy-duty, information-based system where things will move much more quickly, and the winners are going to be people who can share information and get the answers on a larger scale at a faster rate. And that gets me then to biologics, where a lot is happening now that's both exciting and scary at the same time because it's so fundamental. And if you think about it, as you go from a typical drug to a protein to a cell, you've got an extraordinary increase in complexity, with a cell being a living object which is moving around our systems doing all kind of crazy things that are hard to predict. But the great thing now is because so much of it is being quantified, the ability to understand what cells are doing and how to change cellular behavior is moving at a very rapid pace. And so I think you're going to see some pretty amazing things with regenerative medicine in the near future. And the leading case is Casper-Cas9 for genome editing. For those of you really interested in this, the National Academy of Medicine just came out with its report on genome editing this week. I'd actually ask everyone to read the short version, which is pretty easy to read. But I'd say the most revolutionary day for me in my thinking at FDA was one day when we had sequential briefings from the food group, the animal health group, and the human group about gene editing. And the point is that it's actually very easy now to take out a gene, to insert a gene, or to substitute one gene for another. In fact, in the high school science fairs now, for $300 in a kit, a high school student can do gene editing on plants. It's apparently a fairly common high school science project now. And doing it in animals and humans is not really technically much more difficult. And so you begin to think about the 5,000 rare genetic diseases with no treatment. This is exciting and revolutionary. Or you think about the fact that half the food in India is perishing on the way to the table, and that understanding what would induce greater resilience in plants is entirely doable, or nutritional value of plants being upgraded. The main impediment right now is people's tremendous fear of genetically modified food, for example, which after spending many hours on this at FDA, I find completely not understandable, but that's a topic for another day. But on the human side, this brings into mind very fundamental questions about what a human being is and what our rights and obligations are as we deal with this. The point is the technology is here. We've got to figure out what to do with it. And this National Academy of Medicine report, I think, does a pretty good job of laying out some of the criteria. When we talk about international aspects, I'll bring up one other point about that. But the big breakthrough is really in information, and this is something that was really fascinating to see up close with so many smart people aggregated in one place that I could interact with across federal agencies and all of their different components. And I think the thing to watch here will be the Precision Medicine Initiative, which is now called All of Us, which was a presidential initiative, which is now written into the Cures legislation with a mechanism for funding. But the idea here is basically that up until now, if you look at biomedical research, it's mostly been the blind man and the elephant. Each person has some theory or concept that he or she is chasing, and looking at the holistic human being has been an impossible thing to do because there was no structural way to do it with regard to information. Or you could look at it like this, this is a Vanderbilt slide from All of Us that Dan Roden lent to me. We've all known that all these things are important and that, particularly things like environment and social interactions are probably much more important for health outcomes than biology, but we've had no way to put it together into a comprehensive picture. So if it was simple as PowerPoint, it would look like this. But the point is that this is now doable, that we can put together these data structures to get a much more complete picture of both individuals and of populations. And I think this is going to open up some pretty amazing avenues for what you might call holistic health interventions, and not only take into account people's diseases and biology, but also the way they interact and subject themselves to risks of bad things that they hadn't been thinking about. Just one example that came up the other day. Who do you think people that have just committed suicide interacted with last before they committed suicide? Google search is the answer. It's the most common interaction that occurs. There are 2 million searches a day on the term depression happening right now, but many people who commit suicide are frantically on the internet trying to figure out some solution to their problem. So the ability to intervene using the complexity of interactive information at multiple levels is substantial to think about. Now we get to the more sort of traditional DCRI type stuff, and I think the great hope is that we're going to enter an era where doctors and patients could spend their time on values, preferences, and clinical expertise instead of trying to figure out, how to get through the electronic health record and end up with something that allows a bill to be sent to the payer. And of course, this is where the DCRI is a trusted resource to the country, and I can say that for sure. I don't think people are just trying to make me feel better, but you all have a tremendous reputation for producing reliable results, even in cases where you're severely questioned. It's happened several times while I was at the FDA, and I know there's still some episodes of that ongoing, but I wouldn't regard that as a negative. I would regard it as the fact that you're not only producing reliable results, but hopefully you're pushing the frontier that lead people who are used to traditional methods to be concerned. But there's no question that given the explosion of technology, we need a different clinical research system than we currently have if we're going to answer the questions that the public and others will demand. The current system is not delivering the goods. And I still love to talk about Pierluigi and his original entrance when we thought we were going to make him famous by showing that cardiology is so evidence-based, and it turned out that only 15% of our major recommendations were based on high-quality evidence. But the good news is, even as of this year, no specialty has been able to beat that. So that means that most of what we're doing in medicine, has some, I would rather have what we have today than what we had 25 years ago, but we have a long way to go. And answering a few questions very well is not the solution to the problem that we currently have. We need a fundamentally different system that turns around answers at a much faster rate. And if you didn't believe what I said so far, just look at what's happening to the cost of traditional clinical trials relative to the consumer price index. This is not something that's sustainable. And I'm sure you see it here at the DCRI every day as you deal with regulated clinical research. It's something where, see if this rings true to some organizations you may have been in, the leadership sees that things need to change but it's hard to get the rank and file to change because no one's figured out exactly how to do it yet. And so things continue to go on the way they've been. But something is going to have to change. One part of this is a real shift in the way evidence is being used. And this was another fun part of the job for me. I had a lot of interactions with both NIH and CMS. And in the past, the name of the game was getting your product on the market, and then you could employ clever marketing to get it sold. Increasingly now, if you're in Europe, there's a formal health technology assessment done by government agencies, and then payers make decisions. But in the US, CMS is the big gorilla, and it's sort of a combination of a health technology assessor and a payer. And it's fully recognized by the industry that makes medical products that it's got to get through all these hurdles in order to get to the point where individual providers and patients can make decisions. And so there's a real desire by a lot of people to make this more of a continuum and less of an issue where you do one kind of a clinical trial to get through the FDA and then a whole different set of activities to try to convince payers to pay for it. And this view is widely held not just in the US but also in Europe. So stay tuned for where this is going to go. With the new administration, all bets are off, but I think it's very predictable that over time, as information gets better, this will be looked at as a continuum. And then at the core, every decision FDA makes involves a balance of benefits and risks. There's been a lot of stuff in the lay press lately about we just need to prove drugs are safe and then they can go on the market will sort it out. But since there are no safe drugs, at least that I've seen, all of them have risks. It's always a matter of what's the risk relative to the benefit that's achieved when you try to make a decision about whether to use it. But we can impact the system considerably if we change the way we do clinical research and do a much better job of using data that's already being generated in health systems. Next two slides are from Jeff Shuren and his group at the devices part of the FDA, so-called CDRH. And as long as we've had these two different systems, one for FDA and one for everything else, there's been a feeling inside of FDA that we have to do very rigorous internally valid studies, even if they're not generalizable, because it's so hard to figure out whether a treatment has any beneficial effect at all. But if we could improve what happens in terms of real-world evidence, as is already happening under law, we could move up this assessment and sort more of it out later using high-quality data, not by using low-quality data, but high-quality data. And with the things that are on the horizon now, I think the hope is that it will become more of a continuum where you start out with pretty good evidence, people make choices, and then you have a system that operates on a national basis to understand the benefits and risks of medical products. Or another way of looking at it is shown here, that you start out with restricted access and make access greater as the information becomes better. But at the core of this is something that I know DCRI has and continues to take very seriously, the objective assessment of benefit and risk, which is always at the core of every decision that's made. So Jeff's view of this was we need to go from a system of passive surveillance, parallel track to clinical practice, which is what I just described, and these inefficient one-off clinical trials where it's really hard to find the right balance of pre and post-market, to a system in which there's a constant evaluation of what's going on and you embed clinical trials into the system, which much more use of real-world data in more relevant populations, both pre-market and post-market. And this is very much a stated, explicit policy of all the different medical products groups at FDA. And the question is, how can we get there given the comfort that people have in the old system and the way it used to work? The next lesson is that we really do exist in a global environment. And this was a slide from right before I left that we made up as the medical school in Singapore was developing, but it certainly hasn't changed. You'd think that the United States was the majority of the world sometimes when you hear the way people talk about it, but we're actually about 4% of the world's population. Most people live somewhere else, and they're not stupid. And in fact, they're using the same products that we're using, increasingly with supply chains that are all interconnected. But I also wanted to emphasize here that while we live in a global environment, we also live in an environment in the United States which is not homogeneous. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but we have the traditional problems of very different outcomes for different populations, which has been written up a lot. And now the new phenomenon of middle-aged white males going the wrong direction in terms of life expectancy for the first time in a long time. And I think it's very much in our interest, while we're developing better technologies, to also think about how those technologies can be used, not just to make life better for those who already have it good, but how we can use those technologies to help people who are disadvantaged and in some cases actually headed in the wrong direction now. Another way that international work can be leveraged is understanding where this pre-market, post-market balance can be. And particularly with devices, it's well known that criteria for getting on the market in Europe are easier than the United States, quote unquote, and have been. So you have greater, earlier access and greater choice, but with less evidence. Whereas in the U.S., you have delayed access and a restricted range, but requiring typically clinical trials to be done for high-risk devices. These are slides actually, I don't know why this happened, but it was a European presentation done by a Brit, which didn't make any sense. It was in after Brexit, but that's what they chose to do. And the example they used was percutaneous cardiac valve, something I know that the DCRI has been important in with the new registry. It's been kind of fun for me because Sapien is a friend who I've known for a long time, and now he's got the valve that a lot of people are using. But the point is that this valve from 2009 got on the FDA, got through the FDA in 2014, right about the same time the whole next generation of valves got on the market in Europe. And so a lot of effort has gone in the FDA to creating an early device feasibility development program that appears to be succeeding. But we should also be cognizant of the quantitative work that's been done to show that Europeans, in return for getting earlier access to devices, are having significantly more adverse events because no one knows how to use the darn things when they get on the market, and no one's sure exactly which ones are better than the competitors. And then, of course, there's a lot more to medical products and clinical trial results. As a trialist and outcomes researcher, I'm very focused on the outcome data, but I had to learn a lot at the FDA about how products get made, and it's really almost not understandable. But if you look at supply chains now for devices or APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients for drugs, the whole industry has shifted to India and China for the most part, and different parts and components are put together in different places along the way. So when people talk about delays at the FDA, often the delay is not the evaluation of clinical data, it's making sure that the manufacturing chain of custody is something that can produce a reliable product that you can depend on. And this leads to all kind of interesting things, like there are places in China that make parts of products that are in locations where by union rules it's pretty hard to get inspectors there. And I don't know whether that's done on purpose in China, but there might be some reason why that's possible. But it's a very complicated global supply chain with a lot at stake where a lot of work needs to go into assuring its safety. And then point 9, this is old news to you from me, but I think the part of it that I really gained an appreciation for is that inventing, developing, evaluating, and deploying technologies is very dependent on an entire ecosystem. And it's been fascinating to sort of observe that each part of the ecosystem tends to get focused on itself and not realize that if it worked together, you would have a successful system. And whether I like it or not, the ecosystem is very much oriented by body parts or diseases. It's just the way it happens. And I think the simplest way to think about this, and something to emulate in many ways, would be cystic fibrosis. If you go back 30 years ago, children with cystic fibrosis died at an early age. Their clinical care was totally disaggregated. No one knew exactly what to do with them, and very little was known about the biology. For reasons I don't entirely understand, a foundation was put together, mostly comprised of families of people with cystic fibrosis. They got organized. They eventually realized that for clinical care to improve, they were going to need centers that delivered clinical care, and they basically told practitioners, if you want to take care of our families, you need to turn in your data to the quality system that we're assessing and we've developed. And if you don't do a good job, we'll go somewhere else. But they didn't stop there. They also said, we need new therapies. And so they got very involved in developing a clinical trials network, in raising funding for developing new technologies and getting the clinical trials done. And in essence, you now have patients looking for clinical trials, not clinical trialists looking for patients. And the result of all that is about a 25-year improvement in life expectancy in cystic fibrosis, and a tremendous interest and investment in that particular disease, because there's confidence that if an investment is made, things will happen in a predictable way and a result will occur. Whereas in many other diseases that don't have the entire ecosystem in place, there's so much uncertainty that investment goes elsewhere. And a manifestation of this, for those of you who are cardiologists in the room, is that because of the cardiovascular ecosystem and the state of the science, the projected investment in cardiovascular therapeutics is on a log order 10 to the minus 6 relative to cancer and immunology, where also there's a very active and very effective ecosystem that pulls products through in an active, aggressive way. This is a very old slide. It hasn't changed at all, and I guess at least as long as I'm alive, it probably won't. But there's a rationale for the reason that things happen the way they do. And again, my point is that when inventors, small companies, big companies, patient advocacy groups, and FDA review groups are on the same page, this all happens at a much faster rate. And that makes it attractive for people to develop new things and to assess all things. And then finally, as part of the system, there's a special role for integrated health systems now, which was revving up just as I was leaving, but I think has continued to rev up with continued consolidation around the concept that hospitals and practitioners should be integrated together and share information. I see that Kevin's here, and I know he's argued that this is just basically creating monopolies that are not necessarily good for people. I think we may have a middle ground on if people could share information and not create monopolies in other ways, that would probably be good. But the point of this is that I think the most important thing to be done for almost everything I've said so far is for the information that's generated as a part of clinical practice in its broadest sense, not just specialty clinics, but interactions now occurring in primary care and community health clinics and in email interchanges, to be systematically curated and made available for research. Then you'll see the leaps and bounds like what I described in Genome Tracker for preventing and dealing with food outbreaks. I'm going to just go through these slides without going through the detail, but just make the point that this is happening right now, including here at Duke, but mostly for the purpose of business. It's mostly being developed to use algorithms to figure out where to put clinics, how to operate to optimize return on investment for the business. And if we can take that opportunity to develop analytics that really provide information about health and healthcare, it'll solve a lot of the problems at the FDA because we'll have better evidence, and it will improve healthcare because doctors will have a much better idea of what they're doing and not be guessing 85% of the time when they give you recommendations. This is very much a policy at FDA, both on the drugs and devices side, to try to make this happen to the extent we can, but there's a realization that it's not controlled by the FDA or any federal agency. This is now under the control of those who are running the big integrated health systems, including ones like Duke. And so one of the great hopes I have in coming back is that we'll eventually solve the great divide between the DCRI and the rest of the institution so that we can employ some of these methods and knowledge bases on a much broader scale. This is just to make the point that once you have a system in place where data are being systematically curated and collected, it can be used for just about any kind of research. And working across the federal government and with every element of the private sector, we came up with 13 use cases ranging from epidemic surveillance for infections to phase 3 clinical trials, and the solution all looked the same. It was the only way to get this to a feasible state where all these questions can be answered is to take advantage of the information being generated already as part of healthcare delivery. And on that note, I think one thing to watch of interest that I've gotten re-involved with already is PCORnet, which DCRI has been involved with from the beginning. But the concept here, if you combine the power that I've described of patient advocacy groups with the integrated health system, if you could just figure out how to get everybody to work together and share their information, it would have tremendous power for getting a study of any size you can imagine to be done. And in the slide that Adrian Hernandez and Leslie Curtis lent to me, just in this one system now using electronic medical records, there's access to 145 million people. And if we can just figure out how to operationalize it, a lot of the issues with cost and the inability to answer questions would be solved. And then the fun could really occur. And I had the chance to look at what's happening out in Silicon Valley from the point of view of a government agency, and it's really kind of amazing to see because the way the businesses are run is as an information network that's totally dependent on randomized trials to make major decisions. And you don't typically know it, but when you sign on to Google search, you're agreeing to participate in multiple randomized trials all at the same time. And why this is the case for a business like Amazon or Walmart, but it's not the case for something as precious as people's health, I don't know, but it's a problem that we need to solve. And with the right information infrastructure, this could be done on a large scale so that we could sort out what works and what doesn't and get people the right information. So all this is dependent on the places that are educating and training the leaders of tomorrow to figure out how to share. And I've noticed since I've been back that like most places, we haven't solved this yet at Duke. There's still a premium in academia on the primacy of the individual in being a leader. And while I wouldn't ever want to do away with that completely, it's something that we need to work on. And we need to value cleaning up data, which is something that just is persistently undervalued, particularly in healthcare and academia. So I close just by saying you can make the system better as you do your daily work if you identify flaws, come up with design improvements, and keep the ecosystem in mind. I think the secret weapon here that's going to have the biggest impact is actually activated patients who come to realize that their destiny is really dependent on the system working for them. And I've seen a number of cases now in process where entire fields are moving at a much faster pace because patients have taken control. So I'd say the DCRI has been a national asset, but its best days are ahead if it can figure out how to bring these constituents together and more efficiently develop and share knowledge that improves the care of the patients. I don't think the fundamental mission statement should change. It's how you go about it that really should change. So thanks for your attention. I hope this has given you a few things to think about.
One or two?
My professor asked a statistical question. My experience in the past with the FDA has been that the statisticians at the FDA were sticklers, and they would focus on things, well, how do we make sure the p-value doesn't go from 0.05 to 0.055, things like that. In fairness, in the last several months, we had one call on one trial, Frank Agent and I participating. We've gotten feedback from the FDA, the whole team, that was really useful and moving it forward. So is it a new direction that we can expect? What's your experience with the statistical community and what they are doing there?
Let me say, I think, three things about that. First, I think it's fair to say the FDA has been alpha obsessive. But point two, which is related to that, is that you cannot appreciate the degree to which people try to game the FDA until you're on the inside and seeing it. So if you have a marker like a p-value, people are going to try to figure out all kind of ways to get their p-value at a certain point, and I think that leads to an emphasis on extreme rigor in achieving whatever that milestone is. Because remember, whenever there's a controversial decision about approving or not approving something as a binary decision, there's an army of lawyers who will take on the FDA, and process fouls are extremely dangerous. But in the bigger picture, many of you know Lissa Lavange, who's been the head of statistics at CEDAR for a while now, and she's in a very primary role at FDA. We've just brought Frank Harrell, for those of you who remember Frank from the old days, back as a part-time FDA employee, spending a quarter of his time now at FDA. So I think you'll see a migration of FDA statistics. I would also add the device section has been very forward-thinking in terms of using Bayesian statistics as just one example. And that patient advocates are leading the way here. Again, if you look at cancer, why are half the drugs that we're going to see in the next decade at FDA going to be cancer drugs? Part of it is the biology, part of it's the money, but a big part of it is the loosening up of the thinking about study design and criteria for putting something on the market. Eric.
It's almost March. Usually this is the time we start to look forward to seeing what's going to happen to the Duke team. Duke began the season with incredible McDonald's All-American players, #1 ranked team in the country. They've had their struggles, but they're slowly, potentially getting it together. So you can project the Duke basketball team, or you could project 30 years ago, there was a bunch of scientists around here who had some good ideas about where the world was, perhaps far in advance of where the rest of the world was with regard to use of data to change practice. We've had our struggles through certain parts of our career and our time in the season. What's the projection going forward?
I think the projection is in your hands. Hopefully this has given you some insight into where I think the world is headed, and I think, like has always been the case at the DCRI, there's a struggle between how do you exist in a system that you sometimes feel like jumping out of the window about, but if you don't pay attention to the way the system currently works, you're going to get punished and penalized. And then how do you take part of your energy and effort and move the system to where it needs to be? I guess part of what I'm trying to say is don't underestimate the degree to which the people at DCRI influence where the system is going. You're heard all over Washington, I'll just put it that way. So a lot of this, I think, depends on how well you can maintain that balance. And there's also the issue of how well the institution supports the effort, because I think at its best, this will always be a somewhat disruptive part of the university. And if it's not, you would question why it needs to be in a university in the first place. It could be a CRO, and you could be very wealthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.